Well, the Germans are continuing their assault here in the Bulge area. They ran out of supplies, and after punching a couple of holes in the French line, one of their most important attacks here. Oh, sorry, here, coming into this hex here. There was some artillery there that they ended up capturing, etc. It was made completely out of supply. But by that point, the French weren't spending supply. So they figured the French were very, very low. Maybe they had enough for the artillery, but probably not enough for anything else. So they could just continue with their greater strength. No big shelling, just charge forward with men and attack. Something bothers me about the game in that just from thought exercise here, it seems to me that that same kind of policy would probably work about as well with trenches. And what bugs me there is the shelling was part of the dampening of the effects of trenches. Now, I know, but it's just sort of built into the system. It's not all. I know the 1915 has special rules for supreme artillery knocking the trenches out completely. But the reason the artillery fire was done was really to kind of disrupt the defenses enough you could attack, you could approach, and maybe not get completely slaughtered. And somehow it seems to me that if you didn't do that preliminary bombardment, if you didn't have the firepower to do that, sure, your attack is reduced. But the defender, most of his advantage didn't come from the heavy shells, etc. Now, if what we're talking about here with lack of supplies is no guns and bullets, I don't know that any of the Western powers would have launched an assault in that condition. So it's kind of something feels wrong about allowing these in quite the way they do. There should be more penalty or something like that. There should be some serious disincentive when both sides are out of ammo, basically. But anyway, it's working out. It's certainly, you wouldn't go up against an opponent who is supplied if you could help it. But yeah, the Germans are, inching their way closer and closer to Paris for the Schlieffen Plan thing. We're already within 4. Now they're down to 3. They get one more hex that gives them a couple of shifts. And when I look at the strength point comparison, they are way ahead. They've really done a lot of damage to the Allies by being able to stretch the line out and pick their attacks where they want it more than was historical. And I don't know. All right, as I enter into the Allied turn, I was placing reinforcements. I noticed this piece here, this 4-4 by the unit, this LHR. I was able to tell this is the unit, although it was kind of a pain because of sorting issues. But it's listed here as a 134 infantry. Okay, great. Maybe one, maybe the other's correct. Whatever. I'd leave it as this. But here's the other problem. It's also not marked as reduced, so it's hard to tell. Maybe this was corrected somehow in later editions, but those are only online editions right now, as far as I know. This is the most recent copy. I got it right from the designer, so I would hope so. So it's just a warning. You may want to wait for a more recent copy if you like printed materials to be in their kind of best form. I think the current printed rules, I'm told, are fairly good. I still found some issues with them, but certainly these have a few little issues. Who cares? It's a huge game. This is not going to make a big difference, right? But anyway, not much the French can do. They're pulling their line back a little further, closer and closer to Paris. They abandoned some trenches they had here. It's just not, worth extending the line out there. That wasn't doing them any good. It was just a little bulge out there. And they were able to get a little bit more stiffness over in here. I'm still regretting having moved the English from a more central position because they have so much supply now. They're sitting on 15 supply. They're essentially untouched units, but it's painful to shift and move things around. And, once you get tied into the line like that, if I threw the French up there too, the Germans would just pound through there and, solidify the situation. The coast is important to the English. I don't know what the hell to do if I lose Dieppe and Rouen. I'm out of ports. I can't land anywhere anymore. I think I'd have to start making up rules. So I think the English would be very committed to not losing any more coastal territory anyway. So it's somewhat fitting to them to be where they are. And the Belgian army is never going to move. There's no reason to eliminate it. That eliminating it just makes it available to be replaced. That's disturbing to me. Very disturbing, to tell you the truth. Although it's possible Belgian replacements might come in here, I still don't think they're allowed to do anything unless I attack them. There's sort of this strange ceasefire in existence, which historically happened for a while, but then the Belgians were broken out. The Germans attacked to try to prevent that, blah, blah, blah. It didn't happen here. So if you don't follow the historical line, the rules as written allow something kind of unreasonable to happen because they're just ignored. Now, come on. I think they'd attack something, There's no infantry, there's nothing defending them there. And it feels really goofy to me. Well, I went and looked up the online edition of the rules, and, it actually handles the Belgians somewhat reasonably. They can't be left like this. First of all, you have to leave at least 10 strength points of Germans near Brussels to keep them pinned. It doesn't specify what kind of strength points, so something like this would keep them in place, I guess. I don't know. Maybe it does, but hey, we made up for it, right? But it also, on the first turn of October, they're released. I don't know what the hell to do about that because my rules say, hey, they're stuck there forever, and I'm expecting some kind of escape. So I'm just going to keep playing the way I am. Because they would be a tremendous, certainly I couldn't let them out now. And then, well, what if I throw the German army back there and say, hey, let's make that, I don't know, it's October now, let's make it November, or let's make it January or something like that. What the hell do I do? So I'm stuck with this ridiculous interpretation because the written rules that come with the game are so lacking in something so clearly necessary. It kind of makes you wonder, because the system's been around for quite a while now. The way these rules were written, the Schlieffen plan game was around for a while, and I can't imagine that playtests didn't happen where Belgium was left alone like that. It's just, hey, it's there. And when writing, I could see that question coming up in the Schlieffen plan. Hey, this is ridiculous. How long are they going to stay there? That certainly should have factored into this edition. It's also the fact that, well, if you buy it, you get the rules with mistakes like that. Who knows how many changes there are, but I don't want to go online and try to hunt them all down. There's no change log that I saw available and no reference to one. That's what I would want, is just a pure errata to modify it, that seems to have gone out of style. But for those of us who use paper rules, trying to deal with coordinating between an online electronic version that I cannot read with the depth. I mean, if I had 2 copies of the rules, I might go through line by line and change the things that were different in them. But I'd rather not do that. Errata is always the way to do things. Anyway, it's very disappointing when the paper rules don't manage to have the necessary resources to be updated. Well, it's such a, ahistorical occurrence in terms of, you don't know what the Belgians would have done. Maybe they would be locked in there forever. Perhaps some sort of truce or negotiations are going on, whatever. No way to tell, because what really happened was so different, with the Allies actually trying to break them out. We'll just keep playing with this as it is. It's got to be bad news for the Allies, though. That's all I have to say. I am throwing some troops in to kind of garrison that border. They should have been there all the time. They probably could have been. These 2 strength point troops that I've got on the line probably aren't doing me a whole lot of advantage. Anyway, the Germans extend their little bulge a little bit more, or big bulge, or whatever. They ran into a wall here during a column attack, and they also didn't really gain ground, say, here, or, well, they didn't take that. It was somewhere else they attacked it. They didn't gain any ground. It's getting tough. Definitely the lack of supplies hurts them, because they're less likely to provide enough damage to cause the French to retreat. And that means that the French come back with a triple shot. And it's, you really want that overwhelming force to just blow the enemy aside. I don't know whether or not I'm going to make it to Paris. I think pretty unlikely, because this is beginning to solidify a little bit. But it seems like every time I throw troops in, I'm losing some. But the French get more replacements at this point in the game. They're less mobilized, I suppose. Anyway, we'll keep going. Take the Allied turn and see where that puts us. And as we push into the 6th turn of October, well, the French have thrown more troops into the line. There's still weak spots. It's tough to maneuver things around while you're under an attack. You can't equalize the line. Equalizing the line is something that, I was complaining about. I don't want to do that where things are. Well, it's really tough to actually do completely, because you get different strength units and everything. I guess you could filter guys in and out of the headquarters as to do it, but that means that you've got all those units out for a little while. But where you're under an assault like here, it's just not going to happen. You're trying to react. You can move things maybe a hex from zone to zone. So you got things like this that aren't terribly strong. Plus, you got to worry about, well, how am I equalized against this? I've got to throw more strength in to face, where I've got a lot of enemy units that could attack, but that could devolve into multiple attacks against lighter units and leave the crest alone and kind of leave a bulge in there. There's just so many different options in play here that really, whatever you throw up as a line, the enemy is going to find some way to kind of try to crack it if you're weak. And the Germans are able to get good numbers on it. Whether or not they're going to be able to break it without the supplies, that's a tough call. I do have a few left. I didn't use everything. I've kept 4 supply points out. Mainly that's for if I want to do a big stack, a mobile column attack, to set up a second attack. I found that, well, it's a big deal to have those guys supplied, just because you're not going to get the overwhelming numbers otherwise. But even when I do that, it's just a column attack. It can be halted by, bad die rolls going into place. I also have some dudes heading over into the Brussels area to defend that. I'm going to load this one up because the next one might be kind of interesting. We're going to discuss, the Schlieffen plan. Oh, no, it doesn't end in this next one. Yeah. All right, I'll put it all on one. Keep the number of vids down. Germans continue punching through, widening the hole. We've got the British Cav still holding out here, but we've got Germans down in here. We're going to have to pull back. There's no question. This is good terrain, which is one of the reasons I've been able to hold it. But I gotta stretch the line a little bit more here. This too is being widened. In the sense, widening is good for both of them because they're both out of troops, so it smooths it out. It makes it, less of a sharp angle up and down, and closer to the kind of front line that you'd want to see. But it's not terribly good for the French to see the Germans pushing forward towards Paris, although they haven't gotten any closer. Essentially, my decision here is I'm not going to make it to Paris and be able to take out these big guns during the Schlieffen Plan. I don't know that Paris is really my goal. My goal is destruction of the army, to tell you the truth. But Paris is a lot of points towards the demoralization, so it's kind of nice. But largely, I'm just trying to wipe out that French army. And you can see it's mostly gone. I mean, not mostly, but there's a lot of it missing. There is not a lot of German army missing. Unfortunately, I suspect for the Germans that the rate has to somehow catch up and improve, because it's really tough to defend before you have these trenches, and the German mass is just moving forward. A counterattack just doesn't seem possible. I'm too spread out. I have no reserve to throw at any point in the line, and there's really nowhere. This isn't a tight little salient here. This is a rather broad front. There's nowhere that I can just pinch it off and say, I've done something big here that he's got to react to. He could just kind of subvert any kind of incursion into it. Well, the meat grinder keeps continuing. And, it's not like the Germans are taking losses here that are heavier than the French. They're actually able to inflict more than they receive, as well as gaining ground. You can see they've kind of flattened this out. They made an attack over here, which is going to be kind of a pain for the English to choose how to react to. They're getting encircled here. That's a real problem. Even if they're entrenched, the encirclement, I believe, destroys the effects of the entrenchment. So they pretty much have to slip around and try to maybe do a counterattack or something and solidify the line. One good thing is the English have tons and tons of supplies left. The other thing, obviously, we're seeing the effect of the lack of the Belgian army. I looked over it. Wow, they got 20 supply points left. That would be huge. They couldn't shift it to anyone, but they could bleed the Germans heavily. At this point, their forces are essentially doubled in comparison to what the French and Germans have, because they actually have ammo. Well, as we drift out of October, the English counterattack was not terribly effective. They combined with these French units, French out of supply, had 21 strength points, I believe. The Germans, I think, were at 24, unless they retreated. But they have a big enough stack, as they do almost every year. Here, if the French could get enough force, they could have perhaps forced a retreat. To not retreat. And if you don't retreat, well, you take more losses, but you also do more casualties, and that in the counterattack. And that's really the thing, that they were able to do twice as many casualties, 2 to 4 between the two. The English took 3 of them, so it wasn't as big a deal as the French taking more. The French are really getting hammered and are low on troops. But still, you kind of don't want to see the English taking these kind of losses, because they're not going to be able to recover them terribly well either. Looking at our front, we've kind of pushed almost to Reims, where there's a fortress and a big unit. So that's going to be a tough to expand any further in that direction. The English wall is basically made it tough to expand further in that direction, but we still have kind of a bulge in here that we can keep punching through and trying to push out a little bit. In some ways, though, the Germans are kind of low on troop strength at this point. And I look at what's coming, and it's a lot of French and not too many Germans. So I think the tide is going to start shifting. I don't think the Germans can keep punching through once we hit November. We'll see. I mean, they've still got a little bit of play to push this out further. All right, up this one goes.
In this video, I'll discuss moving units around by railroad. In a previous video, we went over ground movement, which regulates how units move around by marching. In World War I, armies made significant use of rail travel. Armies coordinated with their national railways to pick up units and then transport them in trains along the railroads. On the maps, you can see the rail lines in the area. Solid lines, like you see here, represent double track rail lines, which can handle an almost limitless amount of rail traffic. The dotted lines, on the other hand, are single track rail lines, and these allow very limited amounts of rail traffic. The mechanism for moving units along the railways in the games is called rail movement. It took a lot of rolling stock to move a unit by rail. Due to this, there are limits to how many units a country can move by rail each turn. This limit is called the country's rail capacity, and it's expressed in the number of divisions a country can move by rail per game turn. In the early days of the war, most of a country's railway capacity was tied up in moving soldiers from their homes and barracks to their mobilization stations along the frontiers. In the Tannenberg introductory game, I printed the rail capacity available to each country for each particular turn right on the turn track. You can see that here below. Notice that for the first few turns, neither player can move units by rail as the railways are fully occupied with mobilization. Only on the 6th August turn can the Germans begin to use rail movement. And on that turn, they only have the capacity to move a total of 6 divisions by rail. The Russians, whose mobilization took much longer due to the vast expanse of their country and their comparatively meager railway resources, can only begin to use rail movement on the 1st September turn, and even then, they can only move 2 divisions by rail. Obviously, rail movement can only take place along rail lines. Also, players can only move by rail on the railways within their own countries. The introductory game does not get into the conversion of rail lines in occupied territories by engineer units that other games allow. Also, should enemy forces get into your country, they will intentionally damage the rail lines and the hexes that they move through. So you cannot use rail movement through any hexes that enemy units have been in. To move by rail, you have to be in or move to a hex that contains a rail line you can use. This means that you can use ground movement to get to a rail line and then move by rail during the same turn. But note that units cannot use the column movement bonus if they are going to move by rail. Once a unit is in a hex with a usable rail line, it can entrain, meaning it can load onto rail cars in that hex for a cost of 1 movement point. Once entrained, an infantry unit can move along usable rail lines at a cost of 1/10 of a movement point per hex. Other types of units, like cavalry, move along rail lines at a cost of 1/6 of a movement point per hex. When moving by rail, there is no effect on movement based on terrain. The unit is in rail cars and is basically enjoying the scenery as they move along. Since it only costs a small fraction of a movement point to cross from one hex to another by rail movement, you get the idea that units can move quite a long distance in a single turn by train. There is no movement point cost to get off the trains when you want to, but any unused fractions of a movement point are lost when you do so. Let's look at an example of moving by rail. The German 41st Division starts up here in hex 2003. The German player, let's say, wants to move it down here to hex 1110. There's a rail line in the hex that the unit occupies, so it doesn't have to move to get onto a rail line. It can just entrain, that is, get on the trains, in this hex, and it pays 1 movement point to do so. It would then move by rail down this single track rail line to Königsberg in hex 1506, and then continues along the double track rail line to Elbing in hex 1209. Following the rail lines, this is a distance of 11 hexes, and by rail movement, this will cost the division another 1 1/10 movement points. Up to this point then, the unit has expended 2 1/10 of a movement point. The German player decides to end the rail movement here in hex 1209. By doing so, the total movement point expenditure at this point is rounded up to 3, as the remaining fractions are lost. The unit then crosses from 1209 to 1110 by normal movement, expending the last of its 2 remaining movement points. In this next example, the German 41st Infantry Division starts in hex 2304 up here. It is going to march to a rail line and then use rail movement to get to hex 1711. There it will get off the trains and then march to hex 1712. The unit has a movement allowance of 5 movement points. It'll spend the first movement point moving down here to hex 2305. In that hex, it spends another movement point to board the trains. It then moves by rail to hex 2205, and since it's now moving by rail, each hex it enters only costs 1/10 of a movement point more. So the unit continues moving along the rail line down here to hex 2006, and then again down here to hex 1711. The unit has thus moved a total of 9 hexes by rail, that is, from 2305 down to 1711. Up to this point, the unit expends 2 movement points to get from 2304 to 2305 and then load onto the trains. It then expends another 9/10 of a movement point by moving the 9 hexes by rail to get to 1711. In getting off the trains in 1711, any unused fractions of a movement point are lost, so at the point it gets off of the trains, it expends the last 10th as well. So now it would be in hex 1711, having expended a total of 3 movement points. It would then move normally from 1711 to 1712, expending 1 more movement point. The player chooses to stop moving the unit at this point, even though it still has another movement point of its original 5 remaining. The Germans were incredibly efficient at moving their units by rail. In fact, they could do so under conditions that other armies could not. As you see in the rules, for example, German units can entrain in a hex that is in an enemy zone of control. They can also quickly move off of trains and into combat. As a result, German units can use rail movement and then later in the same movement phase, enter an enemy zone of control. Let's look at an example of a German unit doing these kinds of things. In this example, we'll use the German 41st Division, which is located here in hex 2004. Notice that there are a number of Russian units on the map, and each is exerting a zone of control into adjacent hexes. In fact, right now, the German 41st Division is in the zone of control of this Russian unit here in 2105, the Russian 30th Infantry Division. The German player has the 41st Division expend 1 movement point to entrain in hex 2004. It then leaves the hex and the Russian zone of control in that hex by moving by rail to 2003 to the north. Because it is moving by rail, it does not have to expend, according to the rules, the extra movement point for exiting or leaving the enemy zone of control in 2004. From this point, it would continue moving by rail down the single-track rail line to Königsberg, and then south and slightly to the east to 1810, and then on to 1711. It takes this particular route because it doesn't want to move into hex 1611, which contains an enemy zone of control, because if it did so, it would have to stop moving at that point. By the route it's taken, it's moving 13 hexes by rail. This would cost an additional 1 3/10 of movement points, but since it gets off the trains in 1711, this is rounded up to 2 movement points. So up to this point, it's expended 3 movement points, 1 for in training, 1 3/10 rounded up to 2 for moving by rail for a total of 3. The division then marches south to hex 1712. In doing so, it expends the last 2 of its movement points, 1 for the broken terrain and 1 for entering the zone of control of the Russian 29th Infantry Division. So it's made this complete move, expending the 5 movement points that it has available for the turn. The next topic we will get into is how battles and combat are simulated in the games. Combat is influenced by many factors, but I think the easiest way to understand it is to look at a very simple example and then layer on the different effects in later examples. So that is what I'll do here. The basic principle of combat is that you are using strength to inflict losses on the enemy. So combat involves using the strength points units have to inflict losses on the enemy. So let's look at the most basic of examples and see how it works. Units can attack enemy units in adjacent hexes during their combat phase. Each unit can participate in one attack into one adjacent hex each turn. Here's an example from the Western Front. Let's say that at the end of the German movement phase, we have German and French units in the following situation. Notice first that there are multiple pieces stacked in the same hex. By the stacking rules, you can have up to 6 divisions in the same hex. In this example, there are 2 units in each of the involved hexes. The German player has the 41st and 3rd Reserve Divisions here in hex 1210. Here they are. And then down in hex 1311, he has the 6th Landwehr Brigade and the 1st Reserve Division. Now, the German player is going to use all 4 of these units to attack the 2 French units in hex 1211. And you can see the 2 French units, the 54th and 55th Reserve Divisions here. Now I've taken the units off of the map and put them here so you can more easily reference what I'm talking about. At the most basic level, this is how combat is worked out. First is the attack. The German totals the number of strength points he is attacking with. Look at the number of strength points in the units that he has and add them together. This will be 8 plus 5 from the units in 1210, plus another 2 plus 5 from the units in hex 1311. So this is a combined total that the German will be attacking with of 20 strength points. The German player would now look at the combat results table. This is called the CRT for short. This is printed on the map margin of the Tannenberg introductory game, and in other games it is on a separate card. Now, because he is attacking with 20 strength points, the German player uses the 20 column on this table right here. He rolls a 6-sided die. Let's say he rolls a 4. Here's from the die result. He would cross-index this 4 with the 20 column, and you'd see that the result is a 3. This is the amount of strength point losses the Germans will inflict on the French. The game uses a die roll because so much of combat is unpredictable. But it is not complete chance. Notice that the die roll will allow for variation, but only within a range of outcomes. This range is determined primarily by the strength the player brings to bear. The next part of the combat is the counterattack. The French defenders of Hex 1211 have a total of 8 strength points, 4 from each of the 2 divisions. But since they are counterattacking, and this is very important, their strength is tripled before consulting the combat results table. The tripling of the French strength means that they will use the 24 column on the combat results table. For the counterattack, the French player would roll a 6-sided die, and let's say he rolls a 5. He would then cross-index this result with the 24 column that he's determined to be using, and note that the result is a 4. This is the amount of strength point losses the French defenders will inflict on their German attackers. So the result of this combat are that the French will take a 3 strength point loss and remain in Hex 1211, while the Germans will take a 4 strength point loss. The last part of the combat is actually taking the losses. Players have some latitude in how they take losses, but all of the involved units must first be reduced to backside strength before any other unit can take additional losses. Now in this example, the French need to take 3 strength points and losses. The French will take the first 2 strength points and losses by flipping both divisions over to their backsides. Let me go ahead and do that so you can see it. Okay. And then he places the -1 marker on the 54th Reserve Division's flipped over counter, showing that this division is now at a strength of 2. So at the end of the battle, the French divisions in Hex 1211 went from both being full strength, that is 4 strength points apiece, to one division having a strength of 3, and the other division now having a strength of 2. Now the Germans have to take their 4 strength points and losses. The German player decides that the 1st and 3rd Reserve Divisions will both be flipped over to their backside strength of 3. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, this is a reduction from 5 to 3 for both divisions and would reflect the 4 strength point total loss suffered by the Germans in this combat example. While the German player decided to take his losses from the 1st and 3rd Reserve Divisions, the German player had a number of alternative options. Let's reset back to the original German situation. To take the 4 strength point losses, he could have instead flipped over just the 41st and 3rd Reserve Divisions, and this is what that would have looked like. This also would have accounted for the 4 strength point losses the Germans were assessed in this combat. Let's reset again back to the original German situation. Now, one option the German player could not use is to completely eliminate the 6th Landwehr Brigade and then just flip over one of the other divisions. Here's what that would potentially look like. The German player cannot do this because he cannot take more losses from a single unit, in this case the brigade, than just flipping it over until all of the units involved in the combat are first reduced to their backside strength. The brigade has a backside strength of 1. Therefore, it can't be used to take losses past the 1-point loss of flipping it over until all of the other involved units are at their backside strengths. And notice that in this case, the 41st and 3rd Reserve Divisions are still at their full strengths. So this option is not allowed. Resetting back to the original, the German player therefore decides to reduce the 2 reserve divisions to their backside strength to take the 4 strength point losses he needs to as a result of the combat. And then this shows the final result of both players taking their losses in the combat. So these are the basics of combat we have just gone over. First, the attack. The attacker determines the losses that he inflicts on the defenders. Second, counterattack. The defender determines the losses he inflicts on the attacker. And then third, taking losses. Both sides reduce the strength of involved units based on the results of the attack and the counterattack. Well, these are the fundamentals. A number of other factors can play a significant role in modifying the outcome of combat. These factors include terrain, retreat, and supply. The effects of each of these factors will be explained in subsequent videos.
I want to take a little moment to take a look at some of the an attack in action again. It's something I don't do very often. I realized I screwed up here, but I counted up the strength on these. I'm making an attack here. I just succeeded in making one over here. I counted up the strength on these and the 2 German units that are attacking. And yes, I'm continuing the attacks in the winter, but I'm trying to conserve supplies as much as possible because I think that's vital. I know the French don't have supplies, so they're not going to be able to play here. When I counted that up, I come up with, I don't remember what exactly it was. It was like 57 strength points, which works out to be, what, 28 and a half halved. And it goes up to 29. Great. Okay, so I got 29. I look on here, and I see what I'm likely to get damage-wise. Now, there are 7 French strength points here. 8, 7. They do not have supply, which means they're going to be a counterattacking at a 4 times 3 is 12. If I can't make them retreat, they'll counterattack it at 8 if I make them retreat. Okay. I don't really care about what they do to me on the counterattack, but what I do care is that I cause 4 points of damage because they'll retreat. They're still building their trenches here because I pushed them so far back. Okay, so when I look at the 29 chart, I say, well, I only get a 4 over on a 3, but if I can bump it up to the 32 chart, I get a 4 on a 2. So by spending 1 point of supply, and I've got some supplies now, I end up with this better chart. Now here's the problem. There's actually a little piece of terrain there, a little piece of broken terrain, which is going to give me a -1 and +1 to the die roll. So it's not quite that good. I got to push it further. I kind of do want to take this. 8 more points gets me up to a 41, which is pretty good. I still might fail over here, but as long as I roll a 1 or high, a 2 or higher, 1 total, I'm okay. 8 more is going to cost me 2 more supply though, because see, I've already counted half the strength of the unit, so I'm only getting an extra half. At each point of supply for the Germans, supplies 8 strength points of unit. So I got to throw 2 more supply in. And yes, this is the kind of thing you do. And well, let's see what happens. I just added 8 strength points. I've got a -1 on the die roll. And yeah, I know we've seen the combat before. So I got a significantly good roll. I got a 4. That means I'm going to do 7 points. So I mark that down. Now that's enough to cause it to surrender. So I multiply that by 2 and divide it by 3. And I end up with the French are going to lose 5 and retreat. Now, for the French, I have to subtract 4 from their strength. So they're only going to be rolling on the 8 table, but they have a +1. And they get a 6. They're only going to do 1 to me. And of course, those are going to be reflected here, and I'll show you the retreat in the situation afterward. I also want to point out the application of another rule over here. The French are entrenched. Now, I've got units on opposite sides. You'd think, well, there's a rule that negates the French trench for that. But no, it doesn't, because there are 2 units adjacent to one another, adjacent to it on the French line. And they count as holding that line. So let me see how this works. Right, they don't have to be entrenched. That's important because this guy over here is not. But as long as the line is contiguous, the entrenchments are considered to be an angle in the trench and not a big deal. So they're not actually outflanked there. That's an important situation. If I get this hex, then, or this one, but then this trench would be surrounded and negated by being attacked from the back, and that would be a bad position. I'm going to decide not to attack the trenches. I was planning on hitting them while the French don't have supply. Well, let me rethink that. See, I'm looking at this trench in particular, and I've got some 55 strength points surrounding it. 55 strength points against 1 unit means that, well, that it's not 1 unit, but it's an entrenched 5 strength points. There's a 1 strength point underneath it. That means I'm going to need 5 hits to it. Now, 50 is going to give me 5 if there were no modifiers, but there's a -2 for the trench and another -1 for the terrain there, the broken terrain in between these 2 hex sides, which they can call in. Actually, it's also between these 2 hex sides. So even one of the attackers is actually on it. That means I've got like a 50-50 chance of breaking the line here. The cost would be 7 supply. I only have 30, and I spent a few points already. I think I'm more efficient in spending the points where I've got a weak line already. And I think that's kind of the point to the game is, as long as you've got a weak line, you want to keep attacking it. But once you hit the trench line, you've got to start saving up for the historical offensives. Now, whether or not the lines ever solidify, whether there can be enough French units to hold the line for a whole month, we'll see when that happens. It's going to happen. If you look at the points coming in, the number of troops coming in, eventually there are going to be so many Allied forces on the board here, and there's withdrawals for the Germans, so their troops don't really add much necessarily. Eventually there's going to be so much for the Allies that the German offensive does have to stop. Should it stop now? I don't think so. The situation is still fluid enough that I want to keep fighting. And then I think you start seeing the attack and counter-attack dynamic. We'll see how it works, but I've got really high hopes to see the game rules that don't enforce offensives making them desirable. I've had a lot of worry that maybe it doesn't. And if the front never stabilized, it wouldn't. But I think if it does turn into a true static warfare, it's going to be very, very interesting. I'll count this one, make sure it's okay. And well, after the attacks that made some impressive gains here and here, well, I also made the attacks on the trenches. I just didn't expend supply on them. I did them purely attritionally. This one was wise. I had good numbers there. This one I got bad rolls and less good numbers. Ended up losing an extra point over the French. It was 2-3. Nothing terrible there, but I usually like to cause a decent amount more damage than I'm taking. because I know the German future looks bleak in terms of they're not going to have a lot of points available. All right. I think I ought to split this into pieces because I've got kind of that combat example that I want to point out. Okay.
All right. Yeah, sorry about that, Iggy Crypto. I was gonna hope that maybe I could just pop the text on and just let people chit chat on the comments or whatever, and that way I didn't have to be on the camera. I'm not a big camera person. Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking about just doing some kind of thing like this morning, and it was after Meandering Mike last week, or I mean on Wednesday in the live stream when he popped up a PDF, and I was like, oh goodness, I wouldn't mind maybe doing something like that. Is it 1978? Yeah, you know what, Ken? I'm trying to think of when I was a kid. I remember maybe that would be about then. I remember having to shovel snow, maybe at around that time. I swear to God, it was so bad finishing the driveway, and it was like I got to the end of the driveway and I had to start shoveling again. It was crazy. Yeah, before I end the broadcast or whatever, yeah, I hope you guys have a great remainder of your weekend and so on and so forth. And Charles, thank you so much for continuing your the Mighty Endeavor thing, and it does look like you're certainly going to be do the Russians. It just blows me. I haven't read any of the comments yet this morning on YouTube, so I don't know if you responded to any of the stuff I wrote. But yeah, it just freaks me out that the Germans are so close to the map edge on the Mighty Endeavor, like so close to the arrival points, it seems, for the Soviets. It's like, oh my goodness. I don't know how that's going to develop. I'm like, how the hell are the Soviets supposed to get on the board? All right, guys, I'm going to end it a little bit early here. And yeah, that's about it. I hope to, I guess see you Monday night for 101. That's so cool. Okay. Yeah, thanks for showing up. And yeah, see you next Saturday as well for 007. Okay, bye.